Hi folks, thanks for joining me on the channel. I want to continue on with my Great Books reading plan, year one. And this is the 10-year plan as presented in the Great Books of the Western World. And I'm up to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And this is The Social Contract. Only reading books 1 and 2. There's 4 books in all, but there's plenty to chew on in books 1 and 2. And so I want to talk a little bit about Rousseau, some of the ideas in here, some discussion starters, and then we'll also compare Rousseau to the author who preceded this stage, and that would be John Locke concerning civil government, because these two thinkers are pretty closely related. They're both thinking through social contract theory, but they have some important differences. So we'll just give you some scattered thoughts about that, and this is just a general introduction to the social contract. First of all, a note on Rousseau. I first encountered Rousseau through this book, The Confessions, Penguin Classics edition. I took a interdisciplinary seminar as an undergraduate in Romanticism, and Rousseau is a precursor to Romanticism, so we read this book for that class, and I was very taken with his confessional style of writing. He's such a character, very strong-willed, paranoid, super smart, a wide-ranging in terms of his talents, and just a really, really interesting Enlightenment figure. He definitely points the way towards the age of Romanticism and Revolution. He's a major influence on the French Revolution, probably less so on the American Revolution. I would say John Locke is more of an influence on the American Revolution, but we'll get into that a little bit maybe later. So anyway, I always liked Rousseau, and I've read Discourse on Inequality several times. I taught that book several times, so that's a real classic, very interesting ideas. Social Contract I've read before. This is coming back to books 1 and 2. And read a couple other things by him. Reveries of a Solitary Walker is a really, really cool book. Just a really interesting figure. Anyway, this book, The Social Contract, is really about exploring how individuals can live in a political or a civil society while remaining as free as they can. And the question arises, can they really be free? And I think Rousseau problematizes the social contract theory in a lot of ways, but he has his own flavor of it. So in any way, in books 1 and 2, specifically, he's establishing the foundation for political legitimacy through something he calls the general will. And we might give you some discussion starters for Rousseau, books 1 and 2 of the Social Contract, along these lines. In book 1, we can think about the foundations of society. That's what he's getting into here. He says, famously, at the very beginning, and let me quote this for you, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. One thinks himself the master of others, and still remains a greater slave than they. How did this change come about? I do not know. What can make it legitimate? That question, I think, I can answer." Yeah, interesting, very famous. So, man is born free, everywhere in chains. So Rousseau argues that modern society enslaves us. What are these chains? And if we think about contemporary society, in today's digital world, the corporate world, the technocratic world, what are some of the chains that we might recognize in our society? So that's a discussion starter. Another one has to do with slavery, and one of the chapters in book 1 is about slavery. And let me see if I can find a quote from here where he says, "Force does not create right." He says at the beginning of chapter 4, "Since no man has a natural authority over his fellow, and force creates no right, we must conclude that conventions form the basis of all legitimate authority among men. So man is born free in the state of nature. Might does not make right. Force creates no right. So we have to conclude that conventions form the basis of authority, legitimate authority over men. If a person is forced to obey in this kind of society, do they have a moral obligation to obey? And these are some issues he gets into in book 1. It also touches on a theme of alienation. To enter into the social contract, every person in the society must give up all their rights to the community. And that then creates a community of equals where everyone has the same rights. But some critics think this also risks totalitarianism. And so I'll get a little bit more into this later, but this kind of alienating of your rights under the social contract can create problems. Okay, and then book 2 there's a lot here about sovereignty and the general will. And Rousseau argues that the general will is always right. Always right. And let's get you into the, this is in chapter 3 of book 2. So let me just quote this for you, a little paragraph. It follows from what has gone before that the general will is always right and tends to the public advantage, but it does not follow that the deliberations of the people are always equally correct. Our will is always for our own good, but we do not always see what that is. The people is never corrupted, but it is often deceived, and on such occasions only does it seem to will what is bad. There is often a great deal of difference between the will of all and the general will. The latter considers only the common interest, while the former takes private interest into account and is no more than a sum of particular wills. But take away from these same wills the pluses and minuses that cancel one another, and the general will remains as the sum of the differences. If, when the people being furnished with adequate information held its deliberations, the citizens had no communication one with another, the grand total of the small differences would always give the general will, and the decision would always be good. But when factions arise and partial associations are formed at the expense of the great association, the will of each of these associations becomes general in relation to its members, while it remains particular in relation to the state. It may then be said that there are no longer as many votes as there are men, but only as many as there are associations. He comes up with this concept of the general will, which kind of determines what the common good is. And but he's a smart enough guy that I think he recognizes how fraught this abstraction is. And you really have to think through what is meant by that and how you would be able to determine the general will and how difficult it is to determine what the common good is or the general will. So a whole can of worms is opened up here, but he's kind of willing to go there and assert that you need this infallible general will, that it's always right, but it's a little hard to sort through. Can it just be determined by majority vote, and then we add up the sums? And how does the will of all, which is a sum of private interests, everyone has their own private interests as a citizen in the state, how does that differ from the general will? So these are things to really think through as you're reading the social contract, and it's not easy going in that regard, but I think it's important. He also talks about the lawgiver. He suggests that a superior intelligence is needed to give people their initial laws. Someone like Lycurgus might be a good example. Is it possible for people to create a just government without some kind of divine or charismatic founder? like a founding father figure, as it were. And then this coming back to this idea of being sort of forced to be free, Rousseau states that anyone who refuses the general will, which sort of dictates, the decisions that get made in the society, that they must be forced, compelled to be free. That's a paradox. How can you be forced to be free? Is freedom something that can be compelled by the state? Should it be compelled by the state? So another can of worms is opened up there. But anyway, so you have these different concepts that are arising from the state of nature and the need for a society to protect people's interests. Let's get into comparing Rousseau and Locke. And again, these are just occasional thoughts, nothing too rigorous. I'm just sort of throwing it out there, and we'll see what sticks to the wall. Both of these men are social contract theorists. Their views on the purpose and limits of government differ, though. Like, there's similarities and there's differences. On the point of human nature and the state of nature, in some ways they appear to be pretty similar. Locke views the state of nature as relatively peaceful. You have natural liberties. Remember, he talks about that. You're governed by natural laws that protect life, liberty, and property. And it's going to be the goal of civil society, civil government, to protect those rights once you enter in the social contract. Rousseau believes in the noble savage concept. People are by nature born free, as he says. They're noble, they're savages. The model here might have been like the indigenous peoples of the Americas and elsewhere in the world. A lot of Europeans look to them as being more noble, less corrupted, less fallen than the European civilization. We encountered this concept a little bit earlier in the reading list with Montaigne, his essay on cannibals. But these humans who are originally noble savages, born free, they get corrupted by civilization. And here's the important difference. They get corrupted by the invention of private property. So the attitudes of Rousseau towards private property are quite different from the attitudes of John Locke on private property. Let's get to the role of property. In John Locke, property is a natural right, that it even exists in the state of nature before government exists. And it's the job of the state to protect that natural right to property. In Rousseau, property is a social convention that creates, usually often, it creates inequality. It becomes part of the problem, and the community or the sovereign has ultimate authority over property and property rights once you entered into the social contract and you're in civil society. So very different stamps placed on the role of property. In Locke, property is a good thing. It's a natural right. It needs to be protected. In Rousseau, it creates all kinds of problems, and the state has ultimate authority over property. Let's think also about sovereignty and representation. So in John Locke, he's more or less a supporter of representative democracy, a constitutional monarchy. The people delegate power to the government, but they retain the right to revolt or change that government when it fails them, when it fails to protect life, liberty, and property. In Rousseau, he's less an advocate of representative democracy. He's more a purist, I think, in terms of supporting direct democracy. He argued that sovereignty cannot be represented. It can't be represented. Once you have representatives, you're no longer free. So that's something to think about too. And if you're going to have a society that's sort of founded on principles of direct democracy, you get into some practical issues of like, how would you even determine that? Like, how would you do that? You might be able to do it on a small scale in a city state, but does it scale, right? So these are sort of issues to think about. And the theme of power is where you find some differences between John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Locke sees government as being limited by natural law and the specific consent of the governed. There are boundaries, there are limits. In Rousseau, the sovereign, that would be the people acting as one, like sort of expressing themselves through the general will. The sovereign has absolute power because it's guided by the general will, which always knows best. It's always for the common good. So the general will has, in a sense, sort of an absolutist flavor or a dictatorial flavor to it, which is why some people see tinges of totalitarianism or the potential for totalitarianism in some of Rousseau's ideas. It's very democratic, but then there's this kind of idea of like absolute power. So the takeaway here is that Locke focuses on individual rights against the state, and Rousseau focuses on collective freedom through the state. So yeah, that's some comparisons between Locke and Rousseau. Now let me dig into a couple of these points a little more deeply, then we'll be done. So in Book 1, Rousseau writes that anyone who refuses to obey the general will shall be compelled to do so by the whole body, which means you're forced to be free. We talked about this before. So to understand this paradox, you have to look at how Rousseau defines freedom. He's not talking about the freedom to do whatever you want to do. That would be more of a John Lockean natural freedom notion. He's talking about moral and civil liberty. There's two types of freedom here. One, and Rousseau distinguishes between the chains of nature and the freedom of society. So, in terms of natural liberty, that's the unlimited right to anything that tempts you. Like you're free. And Rousseau views this actually as not being free. That is where you become a slave to your impulses, to just pursue like anything that you want to do. You then become a slave to your desires. But the civil moral liberty is where you're obeying a law that you have prescribed for yourself as a member of the community. I think the idea is because it's good for you and it's good for everybody. It's part of the general will, the common good. So you are obeying laws, but these laws sort of make you free or freer, ideally. So there's a kind of internal logic here that might be hard to follow. But when you join the social contract in Rousseau, you agree to follow the general will because it and it alone represents your own highest rational interest as a citizen in that state. You agree to follow the general will. You have to obey it. Forced to be free. Sometimes your private selfish desires, that would be more what he would call like your particular will, comes into conflict with the common good or the general will. For example, you might want the benefits of driving on paved roads without potholes, but you don't want to pay the taxes to fund the paving of those roads. When the state forces you to follow the law, like paying taxes. It's actually forcing you to act according to the rational commitment you made to yourself and the community when you entered the social contract. You signed on the line which is dotted. And in Rousseau's eyes, the state is simply bringing you back into alignment with your free self, your true self. Rousseau argues that being forced to be free is the only thing that secures a citizen against personal dependence. That's sort of that idea of being sort of your own slave. So in a lawless society, you are at the mercy of stronger individuals like a bully or a tyrant. And by forcing everyone to obey a shared law, the community ensures that no single person is subservient to another person's arbitrary whims. You're protected that way. Like, you only obey the law, you don't obey a master. And this is a big difference between Rousseau and John Locke. So Locke believes you are free when the government leaves you alone to enjoy your natural rights. He kind of reminds me of like the old style Republican Party, not what the Republican Party has turned into. That's crazy clown car territory. But like the old Republican Party, like going back to, like Eisenhower and people like that. You're free, or even Ronald Reagan, like you're free when the government leaves you alone. Negative liberty. To Locke, being forced by the state is almost always an infringement on your freedom. In Rousseau, he believes you're only truly free when you are actively participating in the collective direction of society. That would be called positive liberty. To Rousseau, a person living only for their private interests, as we said before, isn't actually free. They're just isolated, pursuing their desires, being a slave to their desires. So you have to be an active participant in the society, contributing to that expression of the general will. Now, I was thinking, how does some of these distinctions play out in, let's say, like a recent modern issue? This might help us to understand the Rousseau perspective a little bit better compared to the Locke perspective. Again, if you can improve on these thoughts, leave a comment. I'm just throwing it out there. But what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic when people were mandated to wear masks? Remember, we all had to don the masks, and you go to work, you have to wear a mask. You go to school, you have to wear a mask. In the hospital, you wear a mask. Doctor's office, like any retail establishment, you have to wear a mask, or you were strongly urged to wear a mask. Some people were fine with that. They willingly went along with it. And some people vigorously resisted it. The mask mandate, from a Rousseau point of view, I think, is not an act of tyranny. Some would have called it that, some did call it that. The mask mandate was the community forcing its members to be free. How so? Well, think about the particular will aspect. An individual, many individuals, might feel that wearing a mask was annoying, it was uncomfortable. That is their particular will, their private, selfish desire to prioritize their personal comfort and personal convenience over the collective safety of the society. See, the idea with the mask wearing, as I recall it, was, and the social distancing mandates. Remember, you had to stay like 6 feet away from people. The idea was, we're trying to prevent the spread of this virus that's highly contagious, that we don't have effective treatments for, that's overwhelming the hospital systems, where people, I remember the visuals of people in Italy kind of like dying in the hallways, like because there weren't beds for them, and he's just kind of overwhelming the public health system. So they're like, in a sort of act of desperation, they're saying like, would you please wear a mask and stay socially distanced to try to slow down the spread of this disease. The mask didn't necessarily always protect you from getting the disease, but I think the idea was like you're protecting others, like from, you're spewing out your respiratory garbage like into the air for them to breathe. So if you can mitigate that or prevent that, it would help. And again, some people went along with that, some people didn't. So some people, their particular will said, my private self-desire, this is inconvenient, I hate it, it's really uncomfortable, my eyeglasses fog up, I can't breathe, it's a total mess. I don't want to do it. But the general will would be the collective desire for a healthy, functioning society where everyone is safe from a deadly virus, right? So if you're being forced through the mandate to wear the mask, the idea is it's for the betterment of everybody, even, despite the inconvenience of it, despite the discomfort. So when the state mandates mask wearing, it's compelling the individual to act according to the rational collective interest that they implicitly agreed to by being a part of this society. It's like being a team player. You got to play by the rules. Rousseau would argue that by stopping the spread of the virus, the mandate preserves the civil liberty of everyone to live and move safely in public without being infected and potentially killed by this disease. We're talking about it in somewhat abstract terms, right? Because you could argue like maybe your argument would be like the masks are not even effective. It's just a total waste of time. That's a separate argument. But if you grant that the masks had some utility, then this would be the logic of it. Like you have to wear the mask in order to contain the spread of the virus. And even though that violates your particular role, nobody really likes wearing the masks, let's face it, right? It is an inconvenience. So anyway, that's what that is. Now, John Locke would approach the mask mandate in a much more skeptical attitude, perhaps. He would focus on your right to be left alone, the negative liberty. Locke believed that you have a natural right to your own body. A government forcing you to put something on your face would be government overreach of the limited powers that we grant them. And if the mandate doesn't clearly fall within the narrow protection of protecting life, liberty, and property, or if the science is debated, like I said, some people didn't really believe the masks helped at all, Lockeans would argue that the individual retains the right to choose for themselves, that you don't want to dominate individuals and tyrannize over them. So while Locke agreed that we shouldn't harm others' life, health, or liberty, there's still an argument to be made that you should wear the masks under the Locke system. He would prioritize the individual's judgment of that risk over a top-down state mandate, right? So hopefully that gives you some things to think about. But let's finish up with like thinking about if you subscribe to this general will idea, how do you calculate that? Like, how do you figure out what the general will is that is for the betterment of everybody in this sort of equal society that Rousseau is conceiving? Well, the formula in book 2 is you start with the sum of all the individual private desires, the will of all, added up. You subtract the pluses and the minuses, the selfish parts that cancel each other out. And then what's left over, the remainder, is the general will. So, for example, everybody wants low taxes. That's like your selfish desire. Everyone also wants paved roads and safe bridges that don't collapse. That's a common good. And the low taxes desires, they vary in intensity and reason, but the need for a bridge is the common denominator that remains. Everybody needs bridges that don't fall down. And so we're going to have to tax people to pay for those, for the common good. Now, what are the conditions for discovering the common good? Well, Rousseau argued you can only find the general will if certain conditions are met. First, very importantly, no factions. There should be no political parties, no interest groups, no lobbyists. Factions trick people into voting for that group's interest, the party's interest, the industry's interest, the special interest group's interest, instead of the public interest. So you have to eliminate factions. Also, the citizens require adequate information. You must be well informed in order to make sensible, rational decisions. There should be no communication. So paradoxically, he thought citizens should not lobby each other. They should think independently so that their private biases will cancel out naturally. And then you need a society that's equal. If one person's rich enough to buy another person, or one person is poor enough to sell themselves, the general will gets corrupted. Well, these things, factions, no factions, having adequate information, no communication, and equality, these are high bars to clear, just pragmatically speaking. It's going to be difficult. And the general will, I think we need to think of it as an abstract or an ideal rather than sort of something that's like really easy to quantify, because there's really massive risks involved with the general will. One problem is it kind of leaves you open to like a leader who's on the vanguard who's going to like kind of take over things. So if the general will isn't just a majority vote and then we sort of mathematically calculate like what the general will is, you have a leader that might step in, someone like a Robespierre in the French Revolution, who's going to say, well, you think you want X, but I know what the general will is, what the true will is here is actually Y. I'm not a tyrant. I'm just enforcing your own secret best interests. Like, I know better than you do what's best for everybody. Okay? And, coming back to that mask stuff, the COVID-19 stuff, maybe this was part of the problem too. So the vanguard in this instance might have been like the experts, the public health experts, the medical science experts, and people maybe resisted that, like thinking like, well, you're saying you know what's good for us, but do you really know what's good for us? There was a lot of skepticism about that. I'm not making any kind of value judgments. I'm just reporting what people were thinking and saying. And then there's the problem of the tyranny of the objective. So if it assumes there's always one single right answer to political problems, and there's no room for legitimate, permanent disagreement or loyal opposition. So you can see the pathway going down to where like the general will maybe becomes tyrannical in a way, and there's no room for debate on it. That can be problematic. And I'll leave you with this last kind of thought experiment, or just, I was wondering, in our day and age, everyone's talking about AI, right? Could AI be used to determine the general will? This is a cutting edge concept. Researchers call it deliberative AI, algorithmic governance. It's like the high-tech solution, the tech bro solution to Rousseau's biggest problem. How do you find consensus in a large population, not like a small city, but like I say, a nation state? It's really hard to determine what the general will is. Well, maybe if we throw enough technology at it, we could have the computer figure that out for us. So, unlike social media algorithms that thrive on conflict, these AI systems are designed to find common ground. And you kind of cancel out the pluses and minuses, like we were saying before. Some researchers have developed AI mediators that can read thousands of conflicting opinions and synthesize them into a single statement that most people can agree with. There are platforms that use AI to map public opinion in real time. This is another thing I think the whole public opinion industry could be useful to determine the general will. So this is one manifestation of it, using AI. And if a public opinion comment only gets support from one side, it stays at a local level. If a comment gets support from people who otherwise disagree, the AI would boost it as a potential, general will expression. And you could have the AI be used to iteratively refine the general will. So the AI would write some synthesis, draft a consensus. People could critique that, and the AI would sort of update in real time, which would mimic the kind of assembly that Rousseau dreamed of, but is, really hard to put into practice. Again, I'm not saying it's a good idea. I'm just throwing it out there, mentioning it. Rousseau's formula, which would sum the interest of all and subtract the private biases out of that sum, that's essentially what large language models do when they summarize data. So there do seem to be some parallels here. It can be used to eliminate factions. Rousseau really hated interest groups and parties. They manipulate people. So in theory, an AI could just not pay any attention to the party labels, focus only on the underlying values of the citizens. And Rousseau really did think that a superior intelligence was needed to set up the first laws in the first place. And some theorists might see AI as the modern incarnation of that lawgiver, the unbiased, data-driven advisor that points us towards the common good. Now, some people might think that's very utopian, and some people might think that's a nightmare scenario that's fit for a Star Trek episode, right? But it makes for some interesting thoughts. Now, there are some, if we try to use AI to find the general will, there are some Rousseau-style critiques of that method. So currently, the most powerful AI platforms are owned by big tech, private interests. Rousseau would argue that a general will that is owned by a private corporation is not really the general will. That's another form of slavery. Rousseau believed that you actually, as a citizen, must actively participate in the society to be free. And if AI kind of takes your place and just predicts what you would want based on the data, based on the polls, based on, the breadcrumbs that you've left, in your digital footprint. You haven't really actually expressed your will. So again, you really want AI to replace us? And then there's the problem of bias with algorithms. So if the AI is trained on biased data, it really won't find the true general will. It will just find a more efficient way to enforce the prejudices of the majority. So there are problems there. Locke would probably entirely fear the AI solution to any of us. He would see it as a threat, that it's going to steamroll over people's individual rights. Rousseau might be intrigued by the AI method, but he probably would be very cautious about applying it. So, those are just some scattered thoughts about a very thoughtful book, The Social Contract, both concerning civil government by John Locke and The Social Contract by Rousseau. They just make for fascinating thinking. It's just a lot of fun to think about it. Next up on the journey is chapters 15 and 16 in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon. This magisterial, massive, multi-volume work, chapters 15 and 16. It's a fair amount of reading. And in chapters 15 and 16, Gibbon is getting into the history of Christianity and how it was received in the Roman Empire. Lots of cool history there. So if you're following along, get cracking on Edward Gibbon. It's a long read, but he's a great stylist, and I think you'll have fun with it. Let me know what your thoughts are on Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the comments. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.